Okay, so this part of the course will be on pivot tables, and each exercise I'm going to show you will have different workbooks that you'll be able to use to practice what I show in this video. So, first of all, in order to create a pivot table, there are three rules to follow. The number one is to have to make sure that your data is in what's called a tabular format, which we'll see in a moment. And number two is to make sure that there are no gaps in the data. And then number three is to apply the appropriate formatting. So going to number one, and by the way, number one, you'll have a workbook that's called tabular format to practice the same way here. Let's say here, number one, if you have information that's missing, like in this cases, you have the title headings of the columns for the year and the quarter would be missing. We'll have to fix that. But I'll show you in a moment how it won't work without it. So first, for a pivot table to work, you have to make sure that your data is organized in a list with labeled columns, as you see here. So you should have your column names at the top showing distinct categories of your information. For example, the customers, the products, if it's soft drinks or bottles, etc. And then the salesperson, etc. You have your different label headings at the top and the information below. And when you click anywhere in the table, let's say we want to create a pivot table, first you click inside the table, and then to select all of the information, you will use Control A to select the table. Notice that it selects the information like so. And then you'd go to Insert and Pivot Table. Notice first there'll be a small window that appears. It shows where they're getting the information, the source of the information. And then below it shows, it gives you the option to either place the pivot table into a new worksheet or the existing worksheet, perhaps on the right, etc. So here I'll just put it in a new worksheet. But notice when I click OK, it gives the error message that the pivot table field name is not valid. To create a pivot table, you must use data that is organized as a list with labeled columns, etc. So this is because it's missing, and I did this on purpose, it's missing a few columns here. So here we'd have to add sales year and sales quarter. Now let's try this again. I will use Control A to select all, and I click on Pivot Table, and I select I choose New Worksheet, and I click OK, and this time it works. So in this case, I'm just going to delete it because I'm just going through the setup to show what's needed to create a pivot table. So I'm going to delete this for now. So that's the first part, to have your information in a tabular format. So secondly, you have to make sure there are no gaps. If we look at this table here, we'll see that there's some gaps. There are columns and rows that are missing. So here, when you want to select the entire table, again, I will choose Control A, but notice it only selects a part of it because of the gaps. But what I can do is then hold on to Control Shift together, and while Control Shift is being held, I press on the arrow right a few times until it selects everything on the right. And then I do the same thing by going downwards. While holding Control Shift, I will press my arrow down a few times until it selects all of the information. This is to, go over the gaps that are missing. I just basically want to show you that if you do choose Insert and Pivot Table, after you have the dialog box appear where you choose a new or existing worksheet, click OK, you get that same error message because you have the gaps. You can't create your pivot table. So here I'm going to cancel this out. First, I'm going to delete the column here by selecting the entire column by clicking on the the column header, or actually the tab here with the F, and right-clicking and then selecting delete. And I could do the same thing. It would be a bit time consuming, but let's say there'd be several rows. First, I could right click the row and then delete it. But a way to go a bit quicker, more quickly, is to, first of all, while you're inside the table here, again, I'm going to select the entire thing by using Control A and then Control Shift and then down a few times. And this time, if I go to Home and I go to Find and Select and then go to Special, I can click on blanks here and then click OK, and it's going to find the blanks for me. That's one way of doing it. And then I just need to right click and wait a minute, right click and delete. And here, if I click on entire row, it deletes the rows that have that information that's missing. And it's great to know when there are little tricks like that to make you save some time. Let's look now at the formatting. This is to avoid inaccurate reports when creating pivot tables. It's essential to format each column that contains numbers and each column that contains dates as well. So let's make sure, first of all, that the sales column is in a numbers format. So if we go, first of all, to formatting, this is third worksheet. And again, in your information that you'll receive, you'll get workbooks for each of these exercises I'm going through. There'll be one for tabular format, one for no gap, and one for formatting, and there'll be others as we go. So here, if we go to the sales, the sales column here, to make sure that we're talking about numbers, here we go to the home, and in this location here, you pull down this menu and you go to number, like so. So here, we'll make sure that there's only there's no decimal spaces like this, and we can even add maybe a comma with no decimal spaces like this. So and it's up to you if you want to add a dollar amount, whatever you want to do, you add it in this section here at the home. And then let's go to order date, this column here. Now, in this case, for the order date, it's displayed in this format. It doesn't make much sense. This is because Excel treats dates as sequential numbers. So let's convert this into the short dates format. So what we need to do here, again, we make sure we're at the home and go to this section here where you can select from various formats, and you will go to short date. And notice that by doing so now, it gives you the correct dates that refers to each record in the data set. So this is an important part as well. It's just as important as when you're making sure there are no gaps and it has the right tabular format. It's important to make sure that your numbers, whether it's for dates or sales figures or whatnot, have the appropriate format. So those are the first steps into creating your pivot table. Okay, next we're going to look at cleaning your data set. So the problems may occur when you're importing data from external data sources. And one of the problems that may happen is when you get some leading or trailing spaces. So spaces that are just before or just after each word. Let's show an example here. So first, I'm going to create a pivot table. Again, I select Control All once I'm clicked inside of one of the datas. And then I go to Insert Pivot Table. And here, I'm just going to create it next to it here. And then I'm going to select, and this is, by the way, how you create it, and we'll look into more detail in the coming examples. But here, I'm going to drag and drop the data in both the row and then into the values. So this gives me a count of the data. And here, notice that for the item, the first item that ends with 104Z, there are three of them here, but it counts it separately in the pivot table. So why doesn't it group it together and count it as, three of that item? The reason is here is probably because of trailing spaces that either spaces that have come before or after. In this case, if you look by clicking on the data itself, the line, when you press F2, you can see the cursor appears here. There's no problem. It's right after the Z. But if I go to the next value here, by going down here, and again I press F2, notice that there's a space between the Z and the cursor. Also, by the way, I could instead of pressing F2, I could click into the formula bar here and notice it as well here. So here I could manually, delete the space, and the same thing happens here. If I press F2 or go into the formula bar, sorry, here. If I press F2 or F2 and go into the formula bar, I see that there's two spaces in this case. I could delete them manually, or there's a little trick here. What you can do, I selected undo here just to show the little trick. What you can do is, first of all, select the data that you want to make changes, and then you go to data, and you go to text to columns, and then next. And here you make sure that the space is selected as a delimiter. So when you click on next here or finish, and then you check again by selecting Control F2, notice now that, sorry, Function F2, and notice now that the spaces are gone. And by the way, one thing that's important to mention, and I'll probably mention it a few times throughout this presentation, is the pivot table doesn't automatically refresh. You have to refresh it. So here, there's several ways to refresh. There's a refresh all here, but I can always right-click and go to refresh. And now notice now the data has been combined because the spaces have been removed. So you've got to be careful of those pesky spaces that you don't see that might change information in your pivot table because it doesn't recognize it. It recognizes it as separate entries just because of those spaces. But again, that trick with the data text to columns, once you select the data and you go on to remove the spaces, can be very useful and save time, because it can be time consuming to go through your entire data set to try to remove all the spaces manually. So that's a way to save a lot of time. Okay, so let's now look at how to create the actual pivot table. First of all, you'll go to your table of information. And by the way, here we can give the table a name if we wish, just by going once inside the table, just by going to the Tables tab. And then it could be useful to name this table. For example, we'll just call it my table here in this case, but it could be useful to if you want to recall that table later on. And we're going to do the same for the actual pivot table that we'll create. So once you're inside this table, there are several ways that you can create the pivot table. One of which is simply by going insert and then clicking on pivot table right here. And it might be the layout might be a bit different depending on the version of Excel that you have, but you simply need to find insert pivot table in order to create your pivot table. And Excel automatically chooses the data where you clicked inside to know that's where the source of the information will be. And then you have a choice to either create the pivot table in a new worksheet as it goes by default or in the existing worksheet. And here, since the table itself of information it takes so much space, I could create it on the right here, but there's not much space for it. So I will create it in a new worksheet here. So I click on OK. And notice it automatically creates a new sheet here called sheet 1 by default in this case. And here, notice that also on the right, you have your pivot table fields. You can scroll down to see all the different fields that you had. If I come back here, you have all of these headers on the top. When I go back to my pivot table, and you see all of the fields are here. And by the way, if you click anywhere outside of this pivot table one, this window on the left here, notice that it disappears. So you have to make sure that if it disappears and you want it, you have to make sure you click in that again, and then you'll have your choices of how to create your pivot table on the right. So here, by the way that it's constructed here, the way it gives you the options is you have the different fields are on the top left, top right, bottom left, and bottom right, and it resembles this table here, in the sense that the filter, which is the top left, represents the filters that you're going to use depending on what information you're trying to display, which is the top left of the actual pivot table, and I'll show it in more detail once we get an actual pivot table in a few moments. And then the column, which is on the top right here, is aligned with the actual headers of the pivot table on the top of the top row, the column headers of the pivot table that we'll obtain. So that's why it's strategically placed there. And the rows represent the rows that are found on the left of the pivot table, and the values represent the data inside of the main part of the pivot table, all the data that's represented here on the bottom right of the pivot table. So in this case, we're going to just create a pivot table. For example, here we'll start with this. Let's start with the salesperson, or let's bring the customers in the filter area. Let's say we want to have the information on the customers. So first, you see that the main category of this pivot table we're creating is with regards to the customers. You could have, you can choose if it's certain customers that you want to filter out, but that's the main filter that's found on the top left of the pivot table. And then let's say that we want to add the salesperson in the salesperson in the row area. So on the left, you'll have the salesperson. So here, I'm just going to scroll to salesperson. And what happens here, if I did it a bit too quickly, I select it, and you just have to click. Well, by the way, here, if you just click by clicking inside the check mark here, it automatically puts into values. But I'm going to remove it now, the check mark. If you want to put it in the rows, because I want it to be in the rows on the left here, you just have to click and hold down your mouse button, and drag it down to the rows section. And notice now that it gives the rows of the salesperson on the left. And then what we'll choose is we'll go with the sales year in the column area. So we'll have the years. We'll have the salesperson on the left and the sales year on top. So here I go to sales year, and I drag it to columns because I want it at the top here. And then finally, I want the actual sales, the data, to appear in the main part of the table on the bottom right here where the cursor is showing. So I'm going to go to sales and drag that in the values. So what I was trying to explain earlier with regards to the positioning. So again, you have the filters is the information that the main information that you're filtering. In this case, is the customer information, which is on the top left here. So as well, the position of these pivot table fields is on the top left in terms of the filters. The columns, in this case, we chose the sales year. Notice it's on the top right, similar to the actual table, it's on the top right. The rows, we have the salesperson, which is on the bottom left, while here, with regards to my pivot table, I have it on the bottom left here. And finally, the data, which is the main information that we have in our table, our pivot table, is found on the bottom right in terms of the position here of the different fields. And it's also found with regards to this entire table, it's also found on the bottom right here. So that's how you can kind of tell when you're creating your pivot table where you'll be putting your information. So it's as easy as that to create your first pivot table. And it's drag and drop. You can even change the information. Let's say you want to bring the sales year down here and the salesperson up there. Well, then you have the years on the left as the rows, 2012, 13, 14, and you have the salesperson on top. So you can even drag them between each position. So that's the first. That's just creating your first pivot table. Okay, so let's go back and create another pivot table again, and this time really analyze each section, each part of the pivot table. So again, here, if we want to create a pivot table, we click anywhere inside of the table of data, and then we go to insert and pivot table. And again, if we don't create it on this same sheet, we'll just go to the new worksheet, which is given by default here. So I'll click on OK, and it creates a new sheet with the choices that you can add for the pivot table. So here, first of all, if you look at the different parts that I just explained relating to the different fields of the pivot table. First of all, if we look at the rows, these could be something that if you're looking to group products, company names, locations, and business units. So for example, here, we'll take a look at the products, and we'll bring them down to the rows here. And notice that when we do this, in this case, the different products that we have, bottles, ice cubes, soft drinks, and tonic. If I click on the pull-down menu here, we have them detailed here. When you go back to the data, you see that under the products tab here, if I click on the pull down, you have these 4 types of products that are listed there and that appear throughout the table, like so. So it shows here the example of how that information is compiled and shown in this much more precise table that gives a summary of information. So again, here for these, when you're talking about the rows, typically you're looking at grouping products, company names, locations, business units. And then for the column label, you're mainly looking to show the trend of your data. For example, the periods, the time, the months and years. In this example, let's look at the sales year and put it into the column here. So I'll go down to sales year, and I put it in the columns, and you see that it appears here on the top. Now, for the value area, this is where you want to fill and calculate and quantify your information. This can include the sum for sales, the count for the number of units, the average for what you wanted to display the prices, the maximum or minimums with regards to values. And in this example, we're going to grab our sales and drag and drop it into the values area here. So if I go to sales and drag it here, then you get that information displayed here. And notice that when you look on the left, with regards to the bottles in 2012, it calculates that there were about $2.75 million in volume of sales for the bottles. So if you go to your table here and you look again, if I go back and forth here by going back to the table for the bottles, we're looking at 2.75 million. And here, with regards to the bottles, if you were to add the sales for the year of 2012, which would be these sales here, let's say it would end around here, because notice these are the bottles. Oh, actually, I went too far. The bottles here for 2012 would be just this information here. So notice if there would have been bottles sold in 2013 in this table, which I believe is further down. See the bottles here in 2013? These won't be added because yes, it is bottles, but it's in 2013. So the total that's calculated, it adds this data here, these numbers for the bottles that were sold in 2012. This represents that exact number right here where that cell is. And then for the 2013, going back, you'd have to go down to this part here. And if you were to add this information here, which would be, it would add up this data here. It would add up these numbers and give you the total. So for the bottles in 2013, if you go back, that means there were 2.76 million here, 2.85 million in the number of units sold in terms of bottles. So that's how it summarizes the information like that. It's really neat to be able to have that, to summarize it neatly in a smaller table like that. That's what the power of the pivot table. And then you have your report filter, which is the top left. And this is an optional filter. Here you can report, for example, regions, periods, business units, staff, number of staff, either staff or employees in particular. So for example, here we're going to grab our salesperson and our sales region. So if I go to salesperson and I bring it to filters and sales region and into filters as well. Notice that this appears on the top left of the overall region of this pivot table. Because here, what happens is if you click on the pull down, let's say of salesperson, you notice that it considers all of in this case, the 4 people that are included in this table. Because if you go back in this case and you go look at your data, for the salesperson, notice that it's coming back here. Let's say I come back here. These are the only 4 people that appear are Homer, Ian, John, and Michael. So Michael Jackson. And here, these are the only 4 that appear on this column. But the neat thing is here with this option here, the filter, you can actually choose, for example, if you want to see just what Michael Jackson did, you can unselect it and just select Michael Jackson. And then this information is pertinent to just Michael Jackson. And if you want to know what Michael Jackson did in the Americas, then you remove, for example, we'll see the difference here. You'll remove this information here. And it so happens that here it doesn't change the information, probably because it was done only in America. So his sales, if I remove and put Africa and Asia and Europe, he had no sales in these regions. He only had sales in America in this case. But let's try to see if I can go to someone else that has sales at other places, for example. Let's look at Homer Simpson. So if I remove these, and here, if I look at in this case, oh, there we go. So if I remove Asia and Europe, it doesn't change anything for Homer Simpson. In this case, oh, yes. Oh, wait a minute. No, I guess it doesn't. And if I remove America, it's the same. So in this case, Homer Simpson's apparently the sales were all in in Africa. Because if I add Americas, Asia, Europe, there's no sales at all for Homer Simpson. But if I add just Africa and remove the other three regions, then you have all the sales. Let's just confirm if that's the case. So if we go to Homer Simpson and we look here, find Homer Simpson probably at the bottom, notice that all of his sales happen to be in Africa. But if he would have sales in America as well, then you could filter if you wanted just like the sales just in Africa or just in America, etc. And this is just an example of two different fields. So you can have different, various examples. But in this case, we're talking about the salesperson and then the region, and you can, whichever information you want to display, you can choose to display a combination of whatever information that you wish to display like that here. So it's very powerful, and pivot tables are very powerful because you can select the data that you're looking for, and we can switch. As mentioned previously, you can even switch the information from the rows and the columns. I mentioned this here. If you click again inside of the pivot table, again, if this disappears, you just have to click inside the table and it reappears. And again, if you want to switch the sales on the rows and the products on the columns, then you have it displayed in a different format where you have the years on the left and the products on the top instead of having the products on the left and years on the top. You can, easily switch them around like that. So it's very user friendly and it's very powerful. And if you don't get it right the first time, you don't worry. With trial and error, you'll get your desired look. Pivot tables are that easy. Let's now look at drilling down data if we want to maybe make a change to something that looks incorrect. First of all, I'm going to create another pivot table here. So again, once I'm in my data set, I go to Insert and Pivot Table, and then I'll create it in a new worksheet. It appears here next to the sheet that has the data set. And in this case, I'm going to choose to have here, I will have the products on the rows and then the salesperson and sales region in the filters and the sales year in the columns. And then for the sales, I'll bring it in the values, but here I can select it, right click, and within the field settings. There's different ways to do this, but if I right click and select field settings, I can go to get the sum or different things here, the average, maximum, minimum. In this case, I'll want the sum. So here we have a table here that gives the different products, and you can filter for different salesperson and also different regions like we've seen in the past. And let's say here you find that in 2012, it seems incorrect that it was 2.75 million in sales for the bottles. Well, you can double click here to see that specific information. So here you see that by double clicking, you see all of the data within the 2012 series sales year. And we are talking about the bottles for the products. But you have to be careful. Let's say we determine that the mistake is with regards to John's sales here on August 23rd of 2012. Instead of 48,000, let's say he had a tremendous month, then it was actually 300,000. Now, if I change it here, and this preview of the information that I double clicked to generate, notice that when I go back to the table that I've created, if I right click and refresh it, it doesn't make a change. That's because it's important to, if you're going to make any changes, you have to do it within the actual data set. So you can make the changes here. This is just to preview the information. So now let's say we figured out what we need to change is for John's sales on August 23rd. We changed it to 300,000. Well, then we'll go in the actual original data set here, and we'll find this information so we know that it is John. And there's, different ways that you can use to find information. We're talking about John, and we're talking about the bottles, and it's on, let's see here, August. So John's, I'm in 2013, that's why. It's supposed to be 2012. So John's bottles 2012 is here. So we have the 48,000 that we found a while earlier. I could have searched for this information, but let's say I change it now here at the actual data set to 300,000. In this case, now, if I go back to the pivot table and I right click refresh anywhere, now it does make the appropriate change, because of course, if you add another 300,000 to 2.7 million, it brings it up to 3 million. So you can also have a preview or a summary of the totals. Let's say I want to check the totals for 2013. I'll double click on this total here, and the preview it's going to generate, or the snapshot, let's say it's going to generate, will represent all the sales of the year 2013. But again, if you want to make any changes, you have to go to your original data set. You may have a situation where you have several fields, in other words, several labeled columns from your data set, which gives you several fields to choose from here. And perhaps in order to find them more easily, you'd want to put them in alphabetical order. Now, this varies from one version of Excel to the other, but let's say you want to put this in alphabetical order. You might have to search a bit depending on your version of Excel. But in this case here, we go to pivot table, and we can find the option. I think on another version of Excel, you go to option on the first menu here, then options again. But anyway, you find the options of the pivot table, then you go to options again. And here, in this case, it's under layout. You will sort them from A to Z. You click OK, and notice here it does sort them now in A to Z. This is when you have, let's say, 20 different fields or 20 labeled columns for your data set. It'll be easier for you to find them by sorting them this way. Let's say you want to get more precise information from a specific field. Like, for example, bottles. If I double click here on the bottles cell of the pivot table, it gives me options that I can go more specifically. For example, if I want to get the sales quarter, I can click on sales quarter and click OK. And it's going to give a breakdown of the sales quarters for the bottles, which I could click on this little plus minus if I want to hide it. And notice also it now appears at the rows field in the pivot table fields on the right. And I can do the same thing for the columns as well. Let's say for 2012, I click on 2012 here, and I double click, and I go to sales month and click on OK. Now you'll get a breakdown of all the months. And in the same way here, I could click on the plus minus here to make them disappear and get them for the other years as well, if I want to. And notice as well here, now we have sales month appear in the columns field as well. Okay, let's say you want to clear some filters on your pivot table. First of all, let's select some filters just to show the example. Here we'll go with, let's say, simply Africa and Asia, and from the regions and from the person, we'll choose Homer, Ian, and exclude John and Michael. So let's say this is the information we have so far, and we'd like to just clear the filter. What you do is, first of all, you make sure you're in the pivot table and you see the fields on the right. So that way, when you get to the menu on top here, by going up here, either to pivot table analysis or whatever you have for your version of Excel, you can find the clear button, and there'll be a pull down menu here where you can either clear all or clear filters. So if you clear the filters, notice here it brings it back to the default where you've cleared all the filters in one quick step. And if you so choose, you can start from scratch by selecting, your new fields instead of deleting your current sheet with your pivot table. You can just go to clear all, and that way you can start your pivot table from scratch. Okay, when you create a pivot table, it can look pretty bland and without adding styles. And luckily, there are several styles you can choose from. So here, when you go to design in this version of Excel, and you have to look for the design where you have choices of several styles. First, you have to make sure that you're in your pivot table, of course, to be able to see these options. And then once you go to this area where it offers you several styles, here you can either scroll from left to right, or if you click on the pull down, there are actually 85 different styles you can choose from. The first ones on the top here are the light styles, so they're much lighter. They're just mostly the font, the lines that show up. There's no background color really. And then so you can choose the ones that you like from the light styles. If you want to have a little bit of background color, so plus the font, of course, and the lines, then you can choose something in the medium section. For example, with something like this, you have a little bit of color in the back, but it's not that colorful. And then if you prefer something that has much more color, then you scroll down to the dark, and you can choose something that has a lot of color, both in the headers and in the table themselves. So I like to choose something that's a little bit in the middle personally. It's in the medium, something like this. Now the thing is, let's say you don't want your row headers to be to show up with the dark here. The column headers are the row headers, whatever the case may be. Here, if you remove the check mark in column headers, it will remove the color in the background. Same thing would apply to row headers if there were row headers in this case. And then you can also add or remove the banded rows and the banded columns. So basically, these are just the lines. For the banded rows, it would be the horizontal lines that you see here. And then the banded columns, it's you see the vertical lines appear if you wish to add them or remove them, whatever the case may be that you prefer for your style that you like. Okay, now let's say you want to make some changes that are, for example, changes in the style inside the table. Let's say I'll select here the totals and I will put them in italics. Now, let's say you change your style of the pivot table by, again, going to design, in this case, for this version of Excel. And let's say I want to go to the orange one here, or any other style I want to choose. Let's say I'll go to a dark one here. But before I do so, I can right-click and click either apply and clear formatting if I want to remove any formatting I've done by going to the home menu and changing some things in italics or bold and titles or whatever it is. So if I choose apply and clear formatting, it's going to clear any formatting that I've added. As we'll see here, if I click here, notice that it's no longer in italics. But if I go back and this time I choose another table, another uh, design here. And instead, let's say I choose apply and maintain formatting, then notice that the italics are still showing here. So whatever it is, the case may be that you changed in different cells, the formatting when you go to home and you change the formatting in particular for either bold or italics or the size of the font or the font type, etc. So you can either choose to maintain. So again, here, if I go back to the design and I go to a new one, like here, you can either choose to apply and clear the formatting, whatever formatting you added, or apply and maintain the formatting. And once you have a formatting style that you like for your pivot table, you can choose to set it as default. So that way, if you create a new pivot table, it will have that default formatting. So let's say here I go to view a pivot table analysis and I go to clear all and I start over by clicking here the products and then the salesperson and region in the filters, and then the sales in the main values area and the sales year on the columns. So notice that it created the table using that default style that I set up for any new pivot tables that I create.